The autumn term is in full swing now and deadlines are fast approaching. So, to help you with the final touches on your assignments, I wanted to say a few words about proofreading. Most people find it easy to spot problems with grammar or punctuation when reading someone else's writing, but it's always much harder to see these things when looking at your own. Since you won't always have the luxury of having someone else proofread for you, let's look at a few ways to effectively do it yourself. When proofreading your own work, it's important that you know what kind of errors you're looking for. Think about the kinds of things you've had trouble with in the past and try to eliminate them for a start. Now, most people know to look for things like grammar, spelling, and punctuation, but don't forget that the big picture is just as important. Make sure your work is organized in a logical way and that each paragraph represents a clear, distinct idea. You might take yourself to a quiet spot and try reading your work aloud. As you do, make sure it flows. Don't forget to check your referencing and citations. If possible, try to give yourself at least a day or two to complete the proofreading process. It's easier to spot mistakes if you've had a bit of a break from looking at the paper. Well, our research team spent a year looking at the way local government is functioning, talking to the stakeholders, surveying the community, and basically we identified three main issues, three main areas of concern when it comes to government at the local level of the town or city. One of them, and perhaps this is the most important one, is that we need to enable citizens, ordinary people, to take more responsibility. As co-authors of their civic lives, they need to be able to determine what kinds of services and facilities they need, and also, think about how they can contribute in those areas, how they can become involved. A second area we looked at was how to create a public service, and public servants who are able to actually support citizens in what they want and need. Now this should perhaps happen in a more down-to-earth and less bureaucratic way than we've seen in the past. I'm talking about moving towards a more customer-directed approach across the board. Finally, we need to look at the relationships between national government, local government, and citizens, because that has not been functioning as it should. We've had over-directive centralism, and a kind of mistrust has emerged between national and local bodies, and it's the citizens who bear the brunt of this. The earliest writers on politics, and I'm thinking of Plato and Aristotle here, felt free to draw insights from all areas of human knowledge, unlike modern academic writers who tend to put things into smaller and smaller compartments, or focus more closely on one area of inquiry. For example, Plato would examine a whole political system and the philosophy that underlies it, whereas modern writers on politics might concentrate on one particular institution in that system, the House of Lords in England, or on voting patterns within a country. With this focus, the bigger questions that the ancients dealt with, what is the best form of government? Or what is justice? Tend to get left behind. Many writers on politics these days are university-based and so have to have specialized interests, and while they may make new and interesting discoveries in their special field, it is at the loss of a broader perspective, not to mention the loss of a general audience or readership. In the 19th century, there were still writers who used the same freedom of inquiry as the ancients, and are all the more readable and relevant because of it. The assignment that I'm going to set for the holiday period is one that we've given students for a number of years. It's quite practical and will allow you to get out and about. It's no good being shut up in your rooms all the time. It does have a written element, too. Basically it's a data gathering exercise and there are two choices with regard to how you collect the data. We'll go through those in a moment. I'm also going to give you a link to an internet site that is, well, it's critical that you review this before you do anything, as it provides a lot of guidance on data presentation, both in terms of how you plot it, its diagrammatic form and also its description, which has to be clear. This week we're going to be continuing our discussion of women in society. Last week we looked at a number of issues relating to women in education. If you remember, we discussed women both at school and at university. Today we're going to be considering the roles that women play in the workplace. Again, we'll start by taking a historical perspective, and inevitably you'll find that many of the same events that impacted on women in education also had a major influence on their working lives. In the second half of the lecture, I'll concentrate on the situation in Europe today, and I'll invite you to suggest how you think things are likely to develop over the next decade. Okay, so let's get started. To be honest, the biggest problem for most undergraduate students, in terms of academic writing, is not only adapting to a far more structured and formal style, but also learning how to ascertain the difference between important, valid information and unnecessary, or even irrelevant material. In my experience, I would say it takes students their first year, if not longer, to appreciate what is required and to start to implement those requirements in their writing. What they really should be doing, if they are struggling with written assignments, is to seek help from the excellent support services which are available at the university. How did I get into anthropology? Well, I'm not an anthropologist, not trained in it anyway. In fact, I'm a marine biologist, and it's more that I'm interested in the strandlopers, the beach walkers, if you like, than in anthropology generally. In fact, it was through my early interest in all things to do with the sea that I first heard of them. As a kid, my favorite pastime was getting down to the beach and mucking about in rock pools and collecting anything the sea tossed up, and, the strandlopers lived off the sea and seashore gathering food such as mussels, oysters, crabs, and so on, just as I did. So when I heard of them I thought, right, this is my kind of thing, and I felt a kind of, affinity for them. At first people thought they were a myth, I suppose because there didn't seem to be much evidence for their existence, but now we do have archaeological evidence such as pottery, discarded shells, the bones of seals and large fish, and so on. And those shells, we believe, became their first tools, and in some cases were also used as money and jewelry. Of course, before they had the implements, tools to hunt and fish, everything had to be caught by hand, so they kept mostly to shallow water. Then they might have used a primitive form of fishing line, perhaps the tendril of a climbing plant or a strip of animal skin with a bone or small piece of wood that would stick in the fish's throat. Anyway, the more we search the more we discover. Most recently, caves on the coast have been discovered with ancient drawings. I find it endlessly fascinating. How would you define reasonable as it is used in law? For example, you are allowed to use reasonable force when defending yourself. It seems to depend on how serious the situation was, whether it was possible to resolve it by peaceful means, whether you were ready to try those means, and, finally, the relative strengths of those involved. Now, most men know, and they've probably grasped this from their earliest years in the school playground, that, when it comes to blows, fights don't stop until one of you is in no shape to do any damage to the other. The criteria mentioned seem a bit fuzzy to me. How can you convince a jury you were ready to try and talk your way out of it when the other person would have none of it, and, besides, he was quick to land the first punch? Also, you can strike the first blow and still plead self-defense. Of course, you again have the problem of convincing people that the threat was so great that you had no alternative, apart from getting beaten up yourself. Reacting calmly and rationally to a perceived threat is not easy to do. Okay, so the date of the invention of the first clock is disputed among historians, but it's agreed that the first method for telling the time was the movement of the sun across the sky. When the sun was directly ahead, it was midday, and when it was on the horizon, it was early morning or early evening, according to whether it was in the east or the west. However, this method was problematic in terms of accuracy, but nevertheless, it's been used for countless years, from early humanity to dash. It follows from the special theory of relativity that mass and energy are different manifestations of the same thing. Now researchers have stopped light cold and then brought it back to life or light, in an entirely different place. The Harvard researchers sent a light pulse into a sodium cloud cooled to about 460 degrees below zero. That's the theoretical point where matter stops all movement. The light pulse was compressed by a factor of about 50 million at the extreme temperature, and it actually changed state sort of like frozen water. But it also split into two forms of matter. One stayed frozen in the sodium, while the other crawled along at just 200 meters per hour. That second form, called a matter wave, contains the exact information of the original light wave. And when researchers sent it into a second sodium cloud a fraction of a millimeter away, the wave was converted back into light. And since fiber optic communications use light, that means that someday we may be able to stop them, store them and turn them back on, just like a light switch. Have you ever wanted to turn down the volume at a deafening concert or noisy bar? Envy the whale. A new study finds that toothed whales can reduce their own auditory sensitivity when they expect a loud sound. The work is presented at this week's Acoustics 2012 meeting. Whales and dolphins rely on their responsive hearing to interpret returning echolocation clicks. Previous research suggested that these marine mammals could dull their hearing before uttering outgoing echolocation clicks, which are very loud. Could they use the same coping mechanism for external noises? To find out, Easterners researchers trained a false killer whale that a loud noise would always follow a brief warning signal. Then, they attached suction cup sensors to the outside of the whale's head and played the signal. The sensor measured brain waves indicated the whale did reduce its hearing sensitivity in expectation of a clamor. The researchers hope to test other species as well. Loud noises from ships can disturb whales. To accommodate marine life, perhaps vessels could emit signals before making a ruckus, warning whales to tune us out. Before attending the lecture, you must register online or by post. Books for children often contain many beautiful illustrations. Dogs are able to provide assistance to people with disabilities. My technique is to understand the sentence while writing the first letter of each word.